Victoria Hayes looked at the outstretched hand of the man in the charcoal suit, and then in front of 11 board members, she did the one thing that would cost her everything. She folded her arms. "We're waiting for someone with real authority," she said, and let his hand hang there in the silent air until he quietly pulled it back. She thought she'd dismissed a courier. She had no idea she'd just insulted the man who controlled her company's entire $180 million future. What she didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that the quiet man walking toward the elevator had already reached for his phone. And by the time the doors closed behind him, the deal was dead. If you've ever been judged for how you looked instead of who you were, this story is for you. Do me a favor before we begin. Drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments, so I can see how far this story travels. And if you believe respect should come before status, subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end. Because the way this ends, you won't see it coming. Nathan Carter woke that morning to a small hand patting his cheek. "Daddy, Daddy, your tie is on the floor again." He opened his eyes to see Emma, 8 years old, holding up his navy tie like it was a dead snake she'd rescued from the carpet. Her hair was a mess. Her socks didn't match. And her face was the most serious thing he'd ever seen at 6:40 in the morning. "You always leave it on the floor," she said. "Mommy used to hang it up." Nathan sat up slowly. There it was, the little knife that slid in every morning, quiet and precise. 3 years now. 3 years since Sarah. And Emma still measured the whole world against a mother she barely remembered, but somehow never let go of. "You're right," Nathan said. "I do leave it on the floor. That's a bad habit." "Mommy would be disappointed." "She probably would." He took the tie from her small hand. "But she'd be proud of you for hanging it up." Emma considered this. It seemed to satisfy her. "Are you going to the big building today? The tall one?" "I am." "Is it important?" Nathan looked at his daughter for a long moment. "It might be," he said. "But you're more important. You always come first. Remember that." "That's what you say every day." "That's because it's true every day." Hy made her breakfast eggs slightly overcooked the way she liked them, for reasons he'd stopped questioning, and he dropped her at school, and he watched her walk through the gate without looking back, which is what confident children do. And he sat in his car for a moment afterward and let his hands rest on the wheel. Then he drove to Summit Dynamics. The lobby of Summit Dynamics was designed to make you feel small. Nathan understood the architecture of intimidation. 60-foot ceilings. Polished black stone that reflected your own uncertain face back at you. A reception desk that sat like an altar in the center of the room, staffed by 2 young people, whose entire job, it seemed, was to decide whether you belonged. Nathan approached carrying an old leather briefcase. His father's briefcase worn soft at the corners and wearing a charcoal suit that was neither cheap nor expensive. A suit designed to disappear. "Deliveries are around the back," the young man at the desk said without looking up. "I'm not a delivery," Nathan said. Now the young man looked up. His eyes moved across Nathan the way a scanner moves across a barcode. The suit, the briefcase, the plain watch, the lack of anything that announced money. "Are you here to see someone?" "I have a 10 o'clock with your executive board." The young man's expression flickered, not quite disbelief, but something adjacent to it. He typed something, typed again. "I don't see a Carter on the board schedule." "Check the investor list." "I'm sorry, sir, I really don't." A woman appeared at Nathan's elbow. Sharp gray blazer, the smile of someone whose salary depended on smiling. "Can I help you?" "He says he has a meeting with the board," the young man offered with the specific relief of someone handing off a problem. The woman turned her smile on Nathan, and Nathan watched her do exactly what the young man had done. The scan, the calculation, the quiet subtraction. He'd seen this look 10,000 times in his life. He'd learned decades ago not to take it personally. It wasn't about him, it was about them, and about a world that had taught them to read a suit before a soul. "And you are Nathan Carter." "And you represent—" "Myself mostly," Nathan said. "Sometimes other people's money." The woman's smile tightened at the edges. The board is expecting some very important guests this morning. Are you sure you're not thinking of a different meeting? Perhaps you're delivering documents for one of the investment groups. Nathan let the pause sit there. He was good at pauses. He'd learned their value the way some men learn the value of a hard right hand. "Why don't you call up," he said, "and tell them Carter is here. If they don't know the name, I'll walk out and you'll never see me again. But if they do know the name," he let it hang, "you'll want to have told them fast." Something in his voice, not loud, not threatening, just certain, made the woman pick up the phone. 14 floors, up in the glass conference room with a view of half the city. Victoria Hayes was running her own kind of theater. "We do not," she was saying to her assembled executives, "beg. Summit Dynamics does not beg. When the investment group arrives, I want everyone to remember that we are not the ones who need this deal. They are lucky to be in the room with us." Around the table heads nodded. This was Victoria's gift, and Victoria's poison, the total conviction that the world revolved around her willingness to bless it with attention. She was 44 years old, and she had built this company from 22 employees to 2,200, and somewhere along that climb, she had stopped being able to hear the difference between confidence and contempt. Laura Bennett, the chief financial officer, sat 2 seats down and did not nod. Laura had a bad feeling this morning. She'd had it since dawn. The investment group they were courting had been almost aggressively private. No logos, no ego, no demands for the founder's sweet treatment. In Laura's 26 years of finance, the quiet money was always the serious money. It was the loud money you had to worry about. "Victoria," Laura said carefully. "The lead investor, we don't actually know who's coming today. The group sent a single representative. No name attached." "Then whoever it is," Victoria said, "will present to us, and we will decide if they're worthy." "That's backwards," Laura said before she could stop herself. The room went cold. Victoria turned to her slowly. "Excuse me. I only mean they're the ones with the capital. Traditionally in a raise we present to them. Traditionally." Victoria repeated, tasting the word like it was spoiled. "Laura, I did not build this company by doing things traditionally. When they walk in and see what we've built, they'll understand who's in charge." The phone on the credenza buzzed. Emily Ross, Victoria's executive assistant, picked it up, listened, and frowned. "Ms. Hayes," she said. "Reception says there's a Mr. Carter downstairs. He says he has a 10 o'clock with the board." "Carter." Victoria searched her memory and came up empty. "Who's Carter?" Emily checked the schedule. "There's no Carter on the calendar, just the 10 o'clock listed as investment group representative." "So he's the representative." Victoria waved a hand. "The paper pusher. Fine, send him up. Let's get the pleasantries out of the way before the real principals arrive." Laura opened her mouth again, then closed it. The bad feeling got worse. The elevator doors opened, and Nathan Carter stepped into the 14th floor of Summit Dynamics. He was met by Emily Ross, who was the only person in that building all morning who looked at him and simply saw a man. She was 29, sharp, tired, and had learned long ago that the people who dressed down were often the ones you needed to watch. "Mr. Carter, I'm Emily. I'll take you in." She hesitated. "Can I get you anything? Coffee, water?" "Water would be kind of you. Thank you, Emily." She noticed he'd used her name. Most people who came through these doors never bothered with the assistant's name. She noticed it, and she filed it away. "They're all in the conference room," she said, lowering her voice as they walked. "Just so you know, Ms. Hayes runs a warm room like a cold one. Don't take it personally." Nathan glanced at her. A small private amusement touched his mouth. "That's the second time this morning someone's warned me not to take Summit personally." "Then someone downstairs was being kind too," Emily said. "I'm not sure kind is the word, but I appreciate the warning all the same." They reached the glass doors. Through them, Nathan could see the long table the executives arranged like a jury, and at the head, a woman standing with her arms already half-crossed, her chin already lifted, her judgment already made. Emily pushed the door open. "Ms. Hayes, this is Mr. Carter." What happened next took less than 90 seconds, and it would take 8 months, one broken company, and one destroyed career to fully understand. Nathan Carter stepped into the room. He set his old briefcase down beside a chair. And he did what he had done 10,000 times in 10,000 rooms, the ordinary human decent thing. He walked toward Victoria Hayes and extended his hand. "Ms. Hayes, Nathan Carter, it's good to meet you." And Victoria Hayes looked at the man in the charcoal suit, at the worn briefcase, at the plain watch, and the absence of everything. Her instincts told her to respect, and she left his hand hanging in the air. She did not shake it. She smiled, thin and bright and lethal, and she said, "Mr. Carter, I appreciate you coming, but I think there's been some confusion. We're waiting for someone with real authority this morning. If you'd like to leave the documents with my assistant, we'll be sure your firm's principals receive them." The room went silent. It was the particular silence of 11 people watching a car accident in slow motion. Laura Bennett felt the blood drain out of her face. Emily Ross froze in the doorway with a glass of water in her hand. A younger board member looked down at the table. An older one, Richard Coleman, the independent chair, narrowed his eyes because Richard had been in a great many rooms in his life, and he knew the sound of a mistake being made. Nathan Carter held his hand out one beat longer. Long enough for everyone to see it. Long enough that it could never be unseen. Then he lowered it, slowly, without drama, without anger. "Of course," he said. "I understand." And here is the thing that would haunt every person in that room for the rest of their careers. He did not raise his voice. He did not correct her. He did not say, "You have no idea who I am." He did not make a speech. He simply nodded, picked up his briefcase and said, "Thank you all for your time. I hope you have a productive morning." He turned to Emily. "Emily, thank you for the water. I'm sorry I won't get to drink it." And then Nathan Carter walked out of the conference room, past the reception altar, into the elevator, and out of Victoria Hayes's carefully constructed universe. The boardroom did not break its silence right away. For a moment, everyone waited for Victoria to say something that would make it make sense, to reveal a punchline, to tell them the man really had been a courier, and this was all a story they'd laugh about later. Victoria uncrossed her arms and clapped them together lightly, briskly, like a woman dusting off a small inconvenience. "Well," she said, "now that that's handled, let's prepare for the actual meeting." "Victoria." Laura's voice was strange, flat. "What did you just do?" "I sent away a delivery man who wandered into the wrong meeting. He introduced himself as Carter." So, the 10 o'clock was booked under the investment group's representative. There was no other name on the calendar. Victoria. Laura stood up. Her chair scraped the floor loud enough to make people flinch. "There is no other person coming." He was the 10 o'clock. The color did not leave Victoria's face all at once. It left the way water leaves a bathtub slowly, then in a rush at the end. "That's not possible," she said. "That man he was wearing a suit," Laura said. "He was wearing a suit. He had a briefcase from 1985. And a 9-figure decision in it." Laura was already moving toward the door. "I'm going after him." But it was already too late, and some part of Laura Bennett, the part that had spent 26 years reading the temperature of money, already knew it. Because down in the parking structure in the front seat of an unremarkable sedan, Nathan Carter had already made his phone call. "It's me," Nathan said. On the other end, a man named Marcus Webb. Nathan's partner of 19 years, the operational spine of the Carter Fund, recognized the tone immediately. In 19 years, he had heard Nathan angry perhaps 4 times, and Nathan was not angry now. He was worse than angry. He was finished. "How'd it go?" Marcus asked. "We're not doing summit." A pause. "Nathan, we've been building this for 4 months. Due diligence is clean. The numbers are fine. The people aren't." Marcus knew better than to argue with that sentence. In 19 years, that sentence had never once been wrong. "Talk to me," Marcus said. I walked into their boardroom. I introduced myself. I put my hand out. Nathan's voice was quiet, even terribly calm. And the CEO looked at me like I was something the cat dragged in, and she said they were waiting for someone with real authority. and she refused to shake my hand in front of 11 people. Marcus was quiet for a moment. She didn't know who you were. No, she didn't. So it's not personal. She just... Marcus. Nathan closed his eyes. That's exactly why it's disqualifying. If she'd known who I was, she'd have kissed the ground I walked on. She didn't refuse Nathan Carter of the Carter Fund. She refused a man in a cheap suit she thought had no power over her. And that? He opened his eyes, looked out the windshield at the gray concrete. That is who a person actually is. How they treat the man they think can't do anything for them. That's the only real test there is. Silence on the line. You there? Nathan asked. I'm here, Marcus said. I'm remembering why I've followed you around for 19 years. Pull our term sheet, freeze the wire, and Marcus do it quietly. I don't want a press release. I don't want a war. I don't want to embarrass anyone. I just want out. You know what happens when we pull. 3 of our co-investors have their commitments tied to ours. The whole round could... I know what happens, Nathan said softly. That's not my problem to solve. It's hers. He hung up. Then he sat there for a moment, and he did not feel triumphant, and he did not feel powerful, and he did not feel like a man who had just detonated a $180 million deal with a single phone call. He felt tired. He felt the specific tiredness of a man who had spent a lifetime being underestimated and had hoped foolishly that at 58, no, at 38, he corrected himself. He still forgot sometimes that the years had been kind to his face, that it might finally stop. It never stopped. He thought about Emma's face that morning. You always come first. Remember that. He started the car. Upstairs. Laura Bennett caught the elevator down, ran through the lobby, burst into the parking structure and watched a gray sedan turn the corner of the exit ramp and disappear into the street. She stood there breathing hard, and then she did something she hadn't done in years. She said a word her mother would have washed her mouth out for. By the time Laura got back to the 14th floor, the boardroom had reorganized itself into 2 camps. The people who understood what had happened, and the people who were still waiting for Victoria to fix it. Richard Coleman, the independent chair, was in the first camp. He was 71 years old, a former Marine, a man who had sat on 9 boards and buried 2 of them, and he was looking at Victoria Hayes with an expression that Victoria had never seen directed at her before. It took her a moment to place it. Then she placed it, and it made her stomach turn. It was pity. Somebody, Richard said in the slow gravel of a man who chose his words like ammunition, is going to tell me who that man was, and they're going to tell me now. Emily Ross, still standing by the door, spoke before anyone else could. His name is Nathan Carter. She had her tablet out. Her fingers were moving fast. I'm looking him up. There's a Nathan Carter who... She stopped. Her face changed. Emily, Richard said, out loud, Nathan Carter is the founder and principal of the Carter Fund. Emily's voice had gone very careful the way you speak when you're carrying something you're afraid to drop. Private investment group. They don't advertise. They don't do interviews. There's almost no photos of him. But they manage. She looked up. They manage north of $4 billion, and the 10 o'clock on the calendar. The investment group representative, Ms. Hayes, that wasn't a representative. There's a note here from 3 weeks ago. The Carter Fund said their principal would attend personally. Their principal. Nobody moved. He came himself, Emily said quietly. He came here himself to look at us with his own eyes and... She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Victoria Hayes sat down slowly in her chair at the head of the table. For the first time in the 11 years anyone in that room had known her. She looked for a moment like she did not know what to say. Then the moment passed. And Victoria Hayes did the thing that would ultimately destroy her, not the handshake. The handshake was just the match. This was the gasoline. She reached for a reason it wasn't her fault. Well, she said, and her voice had already recovered its edge. If he's that powerful, then he should learn to identify himself properly. A man of that stature walks in with no announcement, no card, no team dressed. Like, how was I supposed to know? He sandbagged us. This is a test. He wanted to catch us off guard. That's a manipulation tactic, and I'm not going to be manipulated. Laura, who had just walked back in, stopped dead. "Victoria," she said. "Do you hear yourself? I hear a CFO who's panicking." "Yes," Laura said. I am. I am absolutely panicking, because I just watched $4 billion refuse to shake your hand and walk out of this building, and instead of chasing him down the stairs on your knees, you are standing here telling me he was rude. He was testing us. How was introducing himself?" Laura's voice cracked across the room. "That's what a handshake is, Victoria. It's not a test. It's the most basic thing one human being does for another. He put his hand out and you left it hanging, and you told him in front of this entire board that he wasn't a person with real authority." The words landed like stones in a pond, and the ripples touched everyone. Richard Coleman spoke into the silence. "Call him, right now. Somebody get Mr. Carter on the phone and put me through. I'll apologize myself if I have to." Emily was already dialing. She had the fund's main line. It rang twice. A calm woman answered. "Carter Fund. This is Emily Ross at Summit Dynamics. I have our board chair, Richard Coleman, who would very much like to speak with Mr. Carter, or with someone on his team at his earliest." "I'm sorry," the woman said, pleasant and immovable. "Mr. Carter isn't available, and I should let you know that our office received a directive 15 minutes ago. The Carter Fund is no longer pursuing any opportunity with Summit Dynamics. All discussions are closed. We wish you the very best." A pause. "Was there anything else?" Emily looked up. She didn't have to repeat it. Everyone had heard the tone of finality bleed through the phone. 15 minutes ago, he had made the call from the parking lot. Before Laura even reached the elevator. Before anyone in this room understood what had happened. The deal had already been dead for 15 minutes while they were still arguing about whose fault it was. "He didn't even wait to get to his car," Laura whispered. "He was in his car," Emily said. "He made the call from downstairs. He didn't even leave the building angry. He just left. And then he ended us." There is a particular kind of quiet that fills a room when everyone in it realizes at the same moment that something cannot be undone. Victoria Hayes felt that quiet, and she fought it the only way she knew how, by refusing to let it in. "This is a negotiation," she said. "Nobody walks away from $180 million over hurt feelings. He's posturing. He wants us to grovel. So we'll send a gift. A formal apology on letterhead. We'll invite him to a private dinner. He'll come around. Men like that always come around because at the end of the day, it's about the return, not the courtesy." Richard Coleman stood up. Richard Coleman was not a large man, but when he stood, the room seemed to reorganize itself around him. "Victoria," he said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it because I think it may be the most important thing anyone says to you this year." He put both hands flat on the table. "You keep saying men like that. You don't know a single thing about that man, but I do. Not him personally, I know his kind. I've met 100 of them, the quiet ones. The ones who dress plain and speak soft and never tell you how much they're worth because they learned a long time ago that the only people worth their time are the ones who treat them well before they find out." He leaned in. "A man like that does not come around. A man like that made his decision the second you left his hand hanging in the air. Everything after that was just paperwork. You don't know that. I know it in my bones. He'll come back." "He will not come back," Richard said. "And I'll tell you how I know. Because if he were the kind of man who could be bought back with a dinner and a letter, he'd never have had the spine to walk out in the first place." Victoria Hayes did not sleep that night. She told herself it was strategy keeping her awake. She sat in her home office at 2 in the morning, drafting and redrafting a letter, deleting the word sorry every time it appeared because sorry felt like a loss, and Victoria Hayes did not lose. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Carter, I fear our introduction got off on the wrong foot due to a scheduling miscommunication." She deleted it. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Carter, I pride myself on running an efficient organization, and in the interest of that efficiency, an unfortunate misunderstanding occurred." She deleted it. She could not for the life of her write the sentence that would have taken 3 seconds to say in person and might have saved everything. "I was wrong. I judged you by your suit. I'm ashamed of myself. I'm sorry." Because to write those words, she would have had to believe them. And Victoria Hayes had spent 22 years building a self that could not afford to believe them. Somewhere back at the beginning, a young woman clawing her way up, dismissed 1,000 times by men who judged her by her appearance, told she didn't have executive presence, told she wasn't the right cultural fit. She had made a private poisonous vow. One day, I'll be the one deciding who has presence. One day, I'll be the one at the head of the table. And nobody will ever look through me again. She had become exactly what had hurt her. And she couldn't see it. That was the tragedy of it. She had built a mirror so flattering that she had forgotten it was a mirror at all. Down the hall, her phone lit up with a news alert she wouldn't see until morning. Summit Dynamics funding round in doubt as lead investor withdraws sources. At the same hour across the city, Nathan Carter sat on the edge of his daughter's bed and watched her sleep. Emma slept the way she did everything fully committed. Arms flung out, mouth slightly open, absolutely certain that the world would still be there when she woke. Nathan envied her that certainty. He'd had it once. Life had negotiated it away from him one loss at a time. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Marcus. He stepped into the hall to answer. You should be asleep. So should you. Marcus sounded wired. It's done. Wires frozen. Term sheets pulled. And Nathan, it's moving faster than we thought. 2 of the co-investors already called me tonight. They're pulling too. They didn't even ask why. They just heard we were out, and they got out behind us. Nathan rubbed his eyes. That's what I was afraid of. Afraid, Nathan, do you understand what's about to happen to that company? Yes. There's still time to make it quieter. We could put out a soft statement. Strategic differences. Protect them a little. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, looking back through the doorway at his sleeping daughter. No, he said finally. No, I'm not going to protect them, and I'm not going to attack them either. I'm just going to tell the truth if anybody asks, and let the truth do what the truth does. He leaned against the wall. Marcus, you know I don't do this. I don't burn people. In 19 years, how many times have I pulled a deal over how somebody treated me? Never, Marcus said. Not once. You've walked from bad numbers, never from a bad person. Because I always figured everybody has a bad day. Everybody's rude once. I don't ruin a company over a bad day. Nathan's jaw tightened. But this wasn't a bad day, Marcus. I could see it. The way that whole building looked at me. The kid at the front desk. The woman in the gray blazer. They weren't following one bad boss. They'd been trained. Somewhere in that company, somebody decided a long time ago that a man's worth is written on his suit. And she's at the top of it. It comes from the top. It always comes from the top. So what do you want to do? Pioneer systems, Nathan said. Marcus blinked, even though Nathan couldn't see it. Brooks's company. They're half Summit size. They're the right size for the truth. Look at them. Really look at them. Not just the numbers, the people. How does Daniel Brooks treat the man he thinks can't do anything for him? Find out. If it's clean, really clean all the way down, I want to move our money there instead. You want to fund their direct competitor. I want to fund the right company, Nathan said. The fact that it happens to be their competitor is just the market doing my talking for me. He paused. I'm tired, Marcus. I'm going to say goodnight to a sleeping 8-year-old and try to sleep myself. Do the work on Pioneer, quietly. You got it, boss. Nathan hung up. He stood in the dark hallway of the small house he'd never bothered to upgrade in the middle of the ordinary life. He'd never bothered to make less ordinary. And he thought about the things Sarah used to say to him back when she was alive. Back when he was building the whole thing from nothing and coming home every night worn down by the endless grinding disrespect of people who thought a soft-spoken man in a plain suit could be walked over. She used to take his face in her hands and say, Nathan, don't you ever let them make you hard. The whole point of climbing up there is so you can reach a hand back down. If you get up there and you can't put your hand out anymore, then they won even if you're rich. Especially if you're rich. He'd carried that for 20 years. He'd built an entire life around a single principle. The first thing you do when you meet a person is offer your hand. Not because of who they are, because of who you are. And today, a woman had left his hand hanging in the air in front of 11 people and had told him he wasn't a person with real authority. She'd been right about one thing and dead wrong about everything else. Nathan did have authority, but he'd never once in his life mistaken authority for the thing that actually mattered. He went back into Emma's room, pulled the blanket up over her flung-out arm, and kissed her forehead. "You always come first," he whispered. "You. And every kid whose dad puts on his one good suit and walks into a building where they've already decided he doesn't belong." Emma stirred, not waking. "Daddy," she mumbled. "Tie's on the floor." Nathan laughed softly in the dark. "I'll pick it up," he said. "I promise." By 9 the next morning, Victoria Hayes understood at last that she was in a war she had already lost. She just didn't understand yet that the enemy she was fighting wasn't Nathan Carter. It was every choice she'd made for the last 22 years, all of them arriving at the same door at the same time, all of them holding out their hands, all of them waiting to see whether she would finally shake one. She sat at the head of her table, watching her CFO read numbers off a screen. Financing delayed, partners requesting reviews, clients postponing signatures, a stock price beginning its long slide, and she heard underneath all of it the sound she couldn't stop hearing since yesterday. The sound of a quiet man saying, "Of course, I understand," and picking up an old leather briefcase, and walking away without ever once raising his voice. Down the hall, procurement director Angela Morris was pulling 4 years of supplier evaluations out of a database because something Laura had said in the elevator that morning wouldn't leave her alone. They weren't following one bad boss. They'd been trained. Angela didn't know Nathan Carter had said those words first. She only knew that when she started reading the old evaluations, really reading them, the ones for the minority-owned vendors, the small family firms, the scrappy little companies run by people who'd walked into this building in their one good suit, she kept finding the same phrases over and over, like a stain that had soaked into the wood. Lacks executive presence. Not the right cultural fit. Concerns about polish. Doesn't inspire confidence in the room. Never a number. Never a metric. Never a single hard reason. Just the same soft, poisonous language applied again and again to the same kind of people for years. Angela sat back in her chair and felt something cold move through her. The handshake wasn't the problem. The handshake had just been the one time it happened where everyone was watching. She reached for her phone, hesitated, and then began very carefully to make a copy of everything. Because somewhere in the building, quietly, without anyone deciding it out loud, people were beginning to choose a side. And it was not Victoria's. By 9:15 that morning, the first bank called Laura Bennett directly, and the man on the other end of the line did not bother with pleasantries. "Laura, it's Tom Reyes at Meridian. I'll keep this short. We're pulling back on the bridge facility, just for a review. 60 days, maybe 90. Laura closed her eyes. Meridian had committed to that bridge facility 8 months ago. Meridian did not review committed facilities. Meridian did not get nervous. "Tom, what's going on?" "You know what's going on," Tom said. "Everybody knows what's going on. The Carter Fund walked. That's not a rumor anymore. It's on 3 wires. When Carter walks, people ask why. And when nobody can tell them why, they assume the worst. So we're going to sit on our hands until somebody tells us the why." A pause. "Off the record. What is the why, Laura?" And Laura Bennett, who had spent 26 years never lying to a lender, opened her mouth and found she could not tell him the truth, because the truth was that her CEO had refused to shake a man's hand. "It's a personality thing," she said finally. Tom Reyes laughed, and it was not a kind laugh. $180 million just evaporated over a personality thing. God help you, Laura. And he hung up. She sat there holding the dead phone, and then she stood up, and she walked down the hall to Victoria's office, and she did not knock. Victoria was on the phone herself, and from the tone of her voice it wasn't going well. "I understand your concern, but I can assure you our fundamentals have not changed in the last 24 hours. Victoria stopped, listened. Her jaw flexed. "That's not no. No, that is not what happened. That's a distortion. I'll tell you exactly what happened when we sit down." She listened again, and something in her face slipped for just a second before she caught it. Fine. I understand. We'll talk next week." She set the phone down very gently, which was worse than slamming it. "Who was that?" Laura said. "Hartwell Group." Laura's stomach dropped. "The co-investors. They're reassessing." Victoria made the quotation marks with her voice bitter and thin. "Do you know what they said to me? And I quote, 'We tend to follow the Carter Fund's read on people.' On people, Laura. Not numbers. People. As though Nathan Carter is some kind of oracle whose feelings we're all supposed to genuflect to." Laura shut the office door behind her. "Victoria, sit down. I need you to hear me, and I need you to hear me as your friend, not your CFO. We are not friends, we're colleagues." The words hit Laura harder than she expected. 11 years. 11 years of late nights in airport lounges and holding this woman's company together through 2 recessions, and in one sentence, Victoria had told her exactly what she was worth. "All right," Laura said quietly. "As your colleague then, here's your situation. Meridian just froze the bridge. Hartwell is reassessing, which means they're gone. They just haven't said it yet. That's 2 co-investors following Carter out the door, and there's a third, and we both know how the third moves." She set both hands on the desk. "By the end of the week, you will not have a funding round. You'll have a hole, and the market will price that hole in, and your stock will find out what a company is worth when the smart money runs from it. Then we find new money." There is no new money. Not this quarter. Not with the Carter Fund's fingerprints on the exit. You don't understand what his name means to these people. When Carter says no, it's not a no about the terms. Everybody knows Carter never walks over terms. So when he walks, they all assume he saw something rotten. And they don't wait to find out what. Victoria stood up so fast, her chair rolled back and hit the credenza. "Then I'll tell them what he saw. He saw a scheduling error, and a woman who didn't roll out a red carpet for a man who deliberately disguised himself to test us. That's what he saw. And when I explain it, you'll be explaining why you didn't shake his hand." Laura's voice was flat as a table. "Do you hear how that sounds out loud? There is no version of that sentence that makes you look like anything but exactly what you were. Stop trying to build a story where you're the victim of a manipulation. You're not the victim, Victoria. You're the reason." For a moment, one raw moment, something moved behind Victoria's eyes that might have been the beginning of understanding. And then the office door opened without a knock, and Emily Ross stood there white-faced, and the moment was gone. "Ms. Hayes, the board is calling an emergency session. 2 o'clock. Mr. Coleman's office sent it out. Mandatory attendance." Emily hesitated. "And there's a reporter in the lobby, from the Journal, asking for a comment about the Carter withdrawal." Victoria seized on it like a drowning woman grabbing a rope. "Good. Good, I'll give them a comment. I'll set the record straight." "No," Laura and Emily said at the exact same time. The 2 of them looked at each other surprised. "No," Laura repeated. "You will not talk to a reporter today. Emily, tell them no comment, thank them for their patience, and get them out of the building." "Victoria, if you say one word to that reporter, you will hand them the rope they hang us with." She was already moving toward the door. "I'm going to see Coleman before 2. Somebody in this company still needs to be trying to save it." She walked out, and Victoria stood alone in her office, and for the first time, she felt the walls of the thing she'd built beginning to lean inward. She did not go to the window. She did not sit down. She stood in the center of the room and did the only thing that had ever worked for her when she was afraid, which was to get angry instead, because anger was a place she knew how to live, and fear was not. "He did this to me," she told herself. "A stranger walked into my building and destroyed 20 years of work because I hurt his ego. That's who the villain is here. Not me. Him." She almost believed it. Almost. By 11 that morning, 4 floors down, Angela Morris had stopped being able to pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. She had printed nothing. She was too smart for that. But she had spent 2 hours reading, and the reading had changed something in her that could not be unchanged. She'd pulled every supplier evaluation the procurement department had filed in the last 4 years, and she'd sorted them, and then she'd sorted them again a different way. And no matter how she sorted them, the same picture kept rising up out of the numbers, like a body surfacing in a lake. The vendors who got approved read like a country club roster. The vendors who got rejected read like the phone book of the neighborhood Angela herself had grown up in, and it wasn't the numbers doing it. That was the part that made her hands cold. On paper, on the objective metrics, on price and delivery, time and quality and reliability, half the rejected vendors scored higher than the approved ones. The approvals hadn't turned on the metrics. They'd turned on the comments. The little narrative box at the bottom of every evaluation, the reviewer notes, where the numbers stopped and the judgment began. Lacks executive presence. Team seemed unpolished in the pitch. Not sure they'd represent us well to clients. Owner was difficult to read. No rapport. Not the right cultural fit for a company of our caliber. Angela had written some of those comments herself. That was the thing that made her sit very still for a long time. She had written them without thinking. She'd absorbed the language from the people above her, from the trainings, from the offhand comments in meetings, from the way a certain vendor would leave the room and a VP would raise an eyebrow, and everyone would know without a word being said that the answer was no. She had learned to translate a bias into a business phrase, and she'd done it so many times she'd stopped hearing what she was actually saying. Not the right cultural fit. She'd typed those exact words about a black woman who ran a logistics firm and had on every measurable axis been the best bidder they'd seen in 2 years. And then Angela had approved a competitor who cost 11% more and had missed a delivery window the previous quarter because that competitor's owner had gone to the same business school as one of the VPs, and they'd spent the whole meeting laughing about a professor they both remembered. She thought she was going to be sick. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number in the building she didn't recognize. "This is Emily Ross, exec assistant. I got your number from the directory. Can we talk somewhere that isn't email or Slack? It's about yesterday." Angela stared at it. Then she typed back one word. "Stairwell. 10 minutes." At 2 o'clock, the emergency board session convened, and it lasted exactly 11 minutes before it went sideways, in a way that no one had planned for. Richard Coleman ran it because in a crisis, the independent chair runs the room, and Victoria had to sit and watch him do it, which was its own private humiliation. He laid out the facts without dramatizing them, which somehow made them worse. The Carter Fund had withdrawn. 2 co-investors had followed. The bridge facility was frozen. The stock had opened down 9% and was still falling. 3 institutional clients had requested clarification calls, which everyone in the room understood to mean they were preparing to leave. So the question in front of this board, Richard said, is not how we replace the Carter money this quarter. We can't. The question is how we survive the quarter at all, and what we tell the world about why we're in this hole. He let that sit. And I'm going to be honest with all of you because I've been on 9 boards, and I've never sat through a meeting quite like this one. The reason we're in the hole is sitting at this table. Every head turned toward Victoria. Victoria kept her chin level. She had prepared for this. "Richard, I've heard the story that's going around, and I want the board to hear my account, because it differs materially from the rumor." Mr. Carter arrived unannounced without identification, deliberately dressed to be mistaken for a courier. He did not present a card. He did not clarify his role. He engineered a situation designed to see how we would react. And when a member of my staff downstairs treated him the way any reasonable person treats an unidentified visitor, he used it as a pretext to walk away from a deal he may never have intended to close. This wasn't about a handshake. This was a sophisticated investor manufacturing an excuse. It was Laura had to admit a good speech. Delivered to a room that hadn't been there, it might even have worked. But 6 of the 11 people at that table had been there, and it was one of them who spoke. Not Coleman. Not Laura. A quiet junior board member named David Okafor. 34, the youngest person in the room who had barely said 3 words in a board meeting in his life. "That's not what happened," David said. Victoria turned. "Excuse me. I was there. I was sitting right there." He pointed at his chair, the same spot. "He didn't engineer anything. He walked in, he set his briefcase down, he came right up to you, and he said, 'Ms. Hayes, Nathan Carter, it's good to meet you.' And he put his hand out. He identified himself. Clearly. By name. The first thing out of his mouth was his name. David's voice was shaking a little, but he kept going. And you left his hand in the air, and you told him we were waiting for someone with real authority. I heard it. We all heard it. There was no manipulation. He said his name, and you looked at his suit and decided the name didn't matter. The room was so silent, Laura could hear the air handling in the ceiling. David, Victoria said, and her voice had gone dangerous. You're new to this board, and I understand the pressure of a moment like this, but I would be very careful about... About what? David said. Telling the truth. You just gave a version of events to your own board that 6 of us know is false. What am I supposed to do with that nod? And there it was, the first crack running right down the middle of Victoria's account, and once it appeared the others could not unsee it either. Laura watched 2 more heads shift. She watched a senior board member named Patricia Wells, who had said nothing. All meeting slowly set down her pen. Is that accurate? Patricia asked to the room. 6 of you were present. Is what David describes accurate? Silence. I'm asking a direct question, Patricia said. And I'd like a direct answer because I just heard our CEO give an account that a board member says is fabricated, and if that's true, that's a bigger problem than the money. Slowly, one by one, the people who'd been in that room the day before answered, not with speeches, with single words, yeses, nods. One woman just closed her eyes and said, "It happened the way David said it happened. I'm sorry, Victoria, but it did." And Victoria Hayes, at the head of the table, felt the last of her prepared story crumble in her hands like dry paper, and she understood in a rush of something close to panic that she had just been caught lying to her own board. That was the moment. That was the real turn, the one that couldn't be walked back. Not the handshake. The handshake had cost her a deal. This right here, the lie exposed in front of 11 people, this was going to cost her the company. She just didn't know it yet. What she did instead was reach for the one thing she still thought she controlled. "I'd like this board to know," she said, and her voice was steel now, cold and clean, that in the middle of the worst crisis in this company's history, we have members of this board and staff who are more interested in relitigating a handshake than in solving our funding problem. I find that misplaced. And I'd remind everyone that meeting minutes exist, that they're privileged, and that this company will speak with one voice or it won't survive. So I'd advise everyone to think very carefully about what gets said to whom and in what forum going forward. It was a threat. Everyone in the room heard it as a threat. And Richard Coleman, who had spent 30 years learning exactly what a threat sounded like when a leader had run out of anything better, folded his hands on the table and looked at Victoria Hayes with an expression that had finally fully turned from pity into something else. Resolve. "Meeting adjourned," he said. "We reconvene Thursday. And Victoria, nobody at this table is going to be told what they can and can't say to this board about what they saw with their own eyes. Not by you, not by anybody. Are we clear?" Victoria didn't answer. She stood up, gathered her things with hands that were almost steady, and walked out. And it was only after the door closed behind her that Emily Ross, standing quietly at the back of the room where the assistant stood, realized that Victoria had said one word too many. Meeting minutes exist. They're privileged. Emily was the one who wrote the meeting minutes. And she suddenly understood that at some point in the very near future, Victoria Hayes was going to ask her to right them wrong. The stairwell conversation between Angela and Emily had happened at noon, 2 hours before the board session, and it had lasted 6 minutes, and it had changed the shape of everything that came after. "I need to know if I'm crazy," Angela had said. "That's all. I just need to know if I'm the only one seeing it." "You're not crazy," Emily had said. "I've been Victoria's assistant for 4 years. I've booked every meeting, transcribed every call, filed every review. And I want to tell you something I've never said out loud to anyone in this building." She'd looked up and down the stairwell. "About 2 years ago, I started keeping my own copies. Of everything. Not because I planned anything, because I got scared. There were things I was being asked to do, smooth out, reword, adjust, that felt wrong, and I didn't want to be the one holding the bag when it came out. So I kept clean copies, originals, time-stamped, everything." Angela had stared at her. Everything. Board minutes, email chains. The performance reviews she asked me to soften for her favorites and sharpen for the ones she didn't like. The vendor stuff I never understood until you just explained it to me. Emily's jaw had set. "I kept it because I was afraid. But I'm going to tell you what I figured out this morning after watching that man pick up his briefcase yesterday. I've been scared of the wrong thing. I wasn't in danger from telling the truth. I was in danger from not telling it. Because when this whole thing comes down, and it's coming down, Angela, I've seen the numbers. The person holding the bag is going to be whoever helped her cover it up. And I am done being that person. Angela had felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. Then we're going to Coleman, she'd said. Both of us. Together. Not alone. Alone we're two disgruntled employees. Together with your originals and my 4 years of evaluations, we're a pattern. And a pattern, Emily had said, is evidence. They'd shaken hands in the stairwell. And neither one of them said it out loud, but both of them thought a handshake had started all of this, and now a handshake was going to finish it. That evening at 7, Victoria did the thing Emily had known she would do. She called Emily into her office, closed the door, and asked her to change the minutes. She didn't call it that, of course. Victoria Hayes had never in her life called a thing what it was. Emily, I've been reviewing my notes from today's session, and I think the record needs some cleanup. Certain comments were made in the heat of the moment that don't reflect the board's considered position, and I don't think it serves anyone to enshrine emotional outbursts in a permanent record. So I'd like you to prepare a clean version. Focus on the resolutions and the action items. Trim the theatrics. David's comments in particular were inappropriate and don't need to be preserved verbatim. Emily stood very still. You want me to remove David's statement from the minutes? I want you to summarize the meeting professionally rather than transcribing a soap opera. His statement was the most important thing said in that room. Victoria's smile thinned. Emily, I'm not asking your opinion on the editorial content. I'm asking you to do your job, which is to prepare minutes that reflect the substance of the meeting. And the substance was crisis discussion adjournment reconvene Thursday. That's the record. Can you have it to me by morning? And here was the moment Emily Ross had been quietly preparing for without knowing it for 2 years. She could say yes. She could go home, and she could produce a sanitized record, and she could keep her job and her salary and the ordinary safety of a person who does what the boss says. Nobody would ever know. Nobody except her. And that, she realized, was the whole problem. She would know. She would carry it. She'd already spent 2 years carrying smaller versions of exactly this, and it had made her someone she didn't want to be, and she was standing at the exact fork where the road either kept getting worse or finally turned. No, Emily said. Victoria blinked. I'm sorry. I said no, Ms. Hayes. I'm not going to alter the minutes. The record is the record. David said what he said, and 6 board members confirmed it, and Patricia Wells asked for it on the record specifically. I can't remove it. I won't. For a long moment, Victoria simply stared at her, as though Emily had begun speaking a foreign language. You understand, Victoria said slowly, that you serve at the pleasure of this office, that your position is not protected, that there are a great many capable assistants who understand the discretion this role requires. There it was. The threat out in the open, no longer even dressed up, and Emily Ross discovered that she was not afraid. She'd expected to be. She'd expected her heart to be pounding. But standing there being threatened by a woman who had refused to shake the hand of the person who could have saved them all. Emily felt nothing but a strange, clean calm. You're threatening to fire me, Emily said, for refusing to falsify a legal document. I'm advising you about the realities of your position. Then let me advise you about the realities of mine. Emily's voice didn't shake. If you fire me for this, I'll walk out of this building, and I'll go straight to Mr. Coleman, and I'll tell him you asked me to alter board minutes, and then terminated me for refusing. And I don't think, given everything else that's happening this week, that you want to add, retaliated against the employee who wouldn't help me cover it up, to the list. Do you? The silence in the office was total. Victoria Hayes had spent 22 years intimidating people, and she was good at it, genuinely good, and she was accustomed to the specific moment when the person across from her folded. She waited for it now. She held Emily's eyes and waited for the flinch, the drop, the capitulation. It didn't come. And in that moment, watching a 29-year-old assistant refuse to blink. Victoria Hayes felt the first true tremor of fear she'd allowed herself since the handshake. Because she understood that the thing she'd always relied on, the fear she could summon in other people, had stopped working. Somewhere in the last 24 hours, the people in her building had become more afraid of covering for her than of crossing her. That was a kind of math Victoria didn't know how to solve. "Get out of my office," she said. Emily got out. And she did not go home. She went down 4 floors to the stairwell, and she texted Angela one line. She just asked me to change the minutes and threatened to fire me when I said no. "It's time. Coleman. Tomorrow morning. First thing." Angela texted back 3 words. "I'll be there. Across the city." At 8:30 that night, Nathan Carter was doing math homework with an 8-year-old and losing. "Daddy, that's not how Ms. Patterson does it." "Well, Ms. Patterson and I are going to have to agree to disagree because 7 plus 5 is 12, no matter how you draw the little boxes. You have to show your work." Emma said it with the moral gravity of a Supreme Court justice. "If you don't show your work, you don't get the points, even if you're right." Nathan set down the pencil and looked at his daughter, and for a second, something went very still in him. "Say that again," he said. "You don't get the points even if you're right. You have to show how you got there." Emma frowned at him. "Daddy, are you even listening? Ms. Patterson says the how is the whole thing." "Ms. Patterson," Nathan said quietly, "is a very wise woman." His phone buzzed on the counter. "Marcus." Nathan kissed the top of Emma's head, told her to finish the worksheet, and stepped into the kitchen. "Tell me about Pioneer," he said. "I'm telling you it's clean," Marcus said, and there was an energy in his voice Nathan hadn't heard in months. "I've spent all day on it. Daniel Brooks. 51 built the company out of a garage, the actual cliché, a literal garage. And Nathan, I did the thing you asked. I did the test. I sent one of our junior analysts in dressed down unannounced, told him to say he was a temp from the staffing agency there to talk about a data entry contract. Nobody in Pioneer knew who he really was. And Brooks came out of his office, shook the kid's hand, walked him back personally, got him a coffee, spent 20 minutes asking him about himself and whether the staffing agency was treating him fairly, because Brooks apparently had a bad experience with a staffing agency 30 years ago and never forgot it. Then he told the kid that if the data entry thing didn't work out, Pioneer was hiring and he should apply directly, and Brooks would personally make sure the resume didn't get lost. Marcus paused. The kid, of course, is a Wharton MBA who runs due diligence for a $4 billion fund. But Brooks didn't know that. Brooks just treats a temp like a human being because that's who Brooks is when he thinks nobody important is watching. Nathan closed his eyes and for the first time in 2 days, smiled all the way. "Show me the numbers." Numbers are strong, not summit strong on the top line, but that was never the point. Solid revenue, low debt, insanely low. Employee turnover. Nathan people don't leave Pioneer. Their average tenure is 11 years. In tech, 11 years. That doesn't happen by accident. "No," Nathan said. "It doesn't. That's a company where people are treated well when the boss isn't watching, and the numbers are just the proof." He glanced back at Emma, tongue between her teeth showing her work. "Marcus, here's what I want. I want us to move on Pioneer, but I don't want it to be quiet." "You said quiet 2 days ago." 2 days ago, I was protecting a company that didn't deserve protecting. Now I'm building something. There's a difference." Nathan leaned against the counter. "I want to fund Pioneer, and I want one condition attached, and I want it public. Before we invest, Pioneer voluntarily adopts real anti-discrimination safeguards in their hiring and procurement. Measurable ones. Transparent scoring. Every vendor, every candidate gets to see exactly how the decision was made. No more hiding a bias behind a phrase like cultural fit. We put it in writing, and we let the market see that this is why the Carter Fund chose them." Marcus was quiet for a second. "You're not just investing, you're making a statement." "I'm showing my work," Nathan said. "My daughter taught me that tonight. You don't get the points even if you're right. You have to show how you got there. I've spent 30 years quietly walking away from people who treated me like nothing. Quiet was the right call when it was just about me. But this isn't about me anymore." He looked at Emma again. "There's a kid out there right now whose dad is going to walk into a building in his one good suit. And I want that building to have already been forced to write down in black and white exactly how they're going to judge him. I want the rules on the wall where he can read them, so he never has to feel the way I felt in that room yesterday. You want to make Summit an example? No, Nathan said, and his voice was gentle. I don't have to make Summit an example. Summit's going to make itself one. All I have to do is build the thing that shows there was another way the whole time. Let people look at Pioneer and then look at Summit and draw their own conclusions. I don't have to say a single word against her, Marcus. I just have to build something true and stand next to it. He hung up and he went back to the table and he picked up the pencil. Okay, he said to Emma. Show me how Ms. Patterson does it. I want to learn the how. By 9 the next morning, Angela Morris and Emily Ross were sitting in Richard Coleman's office with a laptop, a flash drive, and 4 years of evidence, and Richard Coleman was very slowly taking off his reading glasses. He'd been reading for 40 minutes. He hadn't said much. Now he set the glasses on the desk and rubbed the bridge of his nose, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. You understand what you're showing me? Yes, sir, Angela said. This isn't a bad handshake. This isn't one rude morning. This is a documented 4-year pattern of systematic bias buried under professional language running through the procurement and hiring functions of this entire company. And this, he tapped the flash drive Emily had brought. This is a CEO asking her assistant to falsify board minutes and threatening her job when she refused. Yesterday. 12 hours after being caught lying to the board about the handshake in the first place. Yes, sir, Emily said. Richard Coleman leaned back in his chair, and he was quiet for a long time. I've been on this board 6 years, he finally said. And I've told myself that whole time that Victoria was hard but fair, demanding but honest. I told myself the culture was tough because tough builds strong companies. I looked at the growth numbers, and I decided the rest was just noise. He looked at the two women across from him. I was in that room yesterday. I heard David say what he saw. And even then, some part of me was still looking for a way to make it Victoria's word against the room. Because it's easier. Because I like the growth numbers. Because I didn't want to be the man who has to blow up a company. And now? Emily asked quietly. Richard Coleman picked his glasses back up, but he didn't put them on. He just held them. Now I've read 4 years of this, he said, and I can't unsee it, and I've learned something about myself that I don't much like. I've learned that the reason a culture like this survives is not the person at the top. It's the 9 good people at the table who see it and decide it's not quite bad enough to risk their own comfort over. He set the glasses down. The handshake didn't build this. I built this. Every board member who ever looked away built this. Nathan Carter didn't destroy this company. He just held up a mirror, and now we all have to look. He picked up his phone. What are you doing? Angela asked. Something I should have done 6 years ago, Richard Coleman said. I'm opening a formal governance investigation, confidential, independent counsel, and I'm going to need both of you to be willing to say on the record exactly what you just told me. He looked up. I won't lie to you. This will cost you. Whistleblowers always pay a price no matter what the law says. It'll be hard, and it'll be lonely, and Victoria will come after you with everything she has left. So I'm going to ask you both a question, and I want you to think before you answer. He set down the phone. Are you sure? Angela Morris and Emily Ross looked at each other. And it was Emily who answered, and she answered with the thing she'd figured out in the stairwell 2 days before, watching a soft-spoken man pick up an old leather briefcase and walk out of a building that had judged him by his suit. A man came in here 2 days ago, Emily said, and he offered his hand, and this company left it hanging in the air. And I've been thinking about that hand ever since. About how one small decent gesture got treated like nothing by people who thought they were too important for it. She squared her shoulders. I'm sure, Mr. Coleman, because somebody in this building has to be the kind of person who takes the hand, and I've decided it's going to be me. Richard Coleman looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow and heavy, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried too long. And he picked up the phone and made the call that would end Victoria Hayes. 3 floors up, at that exact moment, Victoria stood alone in her office, watching her company's stock tick down another 2% on the screen, and she had no idea that the ground had just finished opening beneath her, that the investigation was already alive, that two women she'd never once bothered to really see had just quietly ended her reign from a room she'd never think to look in. She was still writing the letter to Nathan Carter, still deleting the word sorry, still certain in the deepest and most damaged part of herself that if she could just get the right person on the phone, if she could just explain, if she could just make them understand that she was the real victim here, that everything could still go back to the way it was. It could not go back. It was never going back. And the terrible mercy of it was that Victoria Hayes was the only person left in the entire building who didn't already know. The call Richard Coleman made that morning took 11 minutes, and by the time he hung up, an independent law firm 3 states away had been retained, a document preservation order had been drafted, and the machinery of an investigation that would take Victoria Hayes apart, piece by piece, had begun turning in a room she would never be allowed to enter. Victoria found out about it at 4 o'clock that afternoon, and she found out the way the powerful always find out, that their power has slipped not from an enemy, but from a lawyer. The company's general counsel, a careful man named Peter Sung, who had spent his whole career keeping his head down, appeared in her doorway with a manila folder and a face like a funeral. "Victoria, I need a few minutes." "I'm busy, Peter." "You're going to want to make time for this one." Something in his voice made her look up. Peter Sung had never once in 6 years spoken to her in that tone. He came in, closed the door, and set the folder on her desk, and he did not sit down, which was itself a message. "There's a governance investigation," he said, "as of this morning. Independent counsel reporting directly to the board, specifically to a special committee chaired by Coleman. It's confidential. I'm only telling you because I'm legally required to inform you of a litigation hold that affects your files, your email, your phone, and your calendar. As of right now, you are not permitted to delete, alter, or destroy any company record. Nothing. Not a voicemail, not a post-it note." Victoria's mouth had gone dry. "An investigation into what? I'm not permitted to characterize the scope." "Peter." She stood up. "I built this company. You work for me. Tell me what this is." And Peter Sung looked at her with something that was almost but not quite sympathy, and he said the sentence that made the floor tilt under her feet. "That's the thing, Victoria. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I don't work for you. On a matter like this, general counsel reports to the board. I work for them now. And my strong advice to you, as the one piece of genuine counsel I can still give you as a human being, get your own lawyer. A good one. Today." He picked up nothing because there was nothing to pick up. He'd delivered the whole thing in the folder and in 8 sentences. He walked to the door, and then he stopped, and without turning around, he said one more thing. "I was in the building the day he came. I didn't see it happen, but I heard about it within the hour from 3 different people, and every single one of them told it the same way. You want to know how I knew this day was coming?" He finally turned. Because when the same story travels that fast, told the same way by people who don't even like each other, it's not a rumor, it's a reckoning. It was always going to come. It just needed a door to walk through. He left. Victoria stood alone, and for a long moment she did not move at all. Then she reached for her phone to call her assistant, to call Emily, to have Emily start pulling files, to have Emily. And she stopped with her hand on the phone as a cold new understanding arrived. Emily. The minutes. The threat. "If you fire me for this, I'll go straight to Mr. Coleman." Emily had gone to Coleman. Of course she had. Emily had probably gone to Coleman the same night. Victoria had threatened the one person in the building who kept the records, and that person had walked those records straight up the chain, and now there was an investigation with Victoria's own general counsel telling her to lawyer up. She'd done it to herself. Again. She could feel it now, the pattern, the way every single move she'd made to protect herself had instead handed her enemies another brick. But feeling it and stopping it were 2 different things, and Victoria Hayes had never in her life known how to stop. So instead of stopping, she made it worse. At 5:15, she called the head of HR, a nervous man named Doug Feeney, into her office, and she closed the door, and she said the words that would later become Exhibit F. "Doug, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to understand that it's a performance matter, nothing more." I've had serious concerns about Emily Ross's work quality for some time. Accuracy issues. Discretion issues. I need those concerns documented formally starting today, backdated where the record supports it. I also want you to look very hard at Angela Morris in procurement. I've heard she's been accessing files outside her role, which is a security violation, and I want that on the record too. Build me a file on both of them, quietly, by end of week. Bye. Doug Feeney was a coward, and everyone knew it, and Victoria was counting on it. But even a coward has a moment once in his life when the thing he's being asked to do is so clearly a cliff edge that even a coward's survival instinct kicks in. Victoria, Doug said carefully, there's a litigation hold. This has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with that. You're asking me to build retaliatory files on two employees who Victoria. Everybody in the building knows. Emily and Angela went to Coleman. If I start papering their files the day after they became whistleblowers, that's not a performance action. That's textbook retaliation. It's the single most illegal thing I could possibly do right now. And it wouldn't just end you. It'd end me, for one heartbeat. Victoria stared at him, and the naked calculation in her eyes was so total that Doug actually took a step back. So you're refusing, she said. I'm protecting us both from a federal problem. Get out. Doug Feeney got out. And Doug Feeney, being a coward, did the one thing a cornered coward does that occasionally saves the world. He covered himself. He went straight back to his office, and he wrote a detailed memo time-stamped describing exactly what the CEO had just asked him to do and exactly how he'd refused. And then he emailed it to the independent counsel because Peter Sung had sent everyone in leadership the contact address that morning, and because Doug Feeney had suddenly urgently decided that his own skin was worth more than his loyalty to a sinking woman. By 6 o'clock that evening, the investigation had its first documented act of retaliation delivered voluntarily by the head of HR, less than 9 hours after the investigation began. Victoria had done it again. She'd reached for a weapon, and it had turned into evidence in her hand. That was the pattern now. She just couldn't see it because a person drowning cannot study the water. Across town at 6:30. Nathan Carter's phone rang, and it was Daniel Brooks, and Nathan let it go to the second ring before he picked up because he wanted to hear how the man opened. Mr. Carter, this is Dan Brooks over at Pioneer. Your Mr. Webb tells me you're the fella who sent a spy into my building last week. Nathan smiled. I prefer analyst. Analyst spy, whatever you call it. The kid was polite, so I'll let it slide. Brooks's voice was warm, gravelly, unpretentious. The voice of a man who'd never learned to be anyone but himself. Now, your people came to me with a term sheet that has more money in it than I've seen in my whole life, and it comes with a condition I've got some questions about. This anti-discrimination framework thing. Transparent scoring. Publishing our criteria. I want to understand what I'm signing up for before I sign up for it. Ask your questions. Straight one then. Is this real, or is this window dressing because I've been offered money before by people who wanted me to hang a nice sign in the lobby and change nothing behind it? If that's what this is, I'm not interested, no matter the number. Nathan set down the dish he'd been drying. Emma was in the next room, and he lowered his voice. Mr. Brooks, 2 days ago I walked into a company we were about to give $180 million, and I put my hand out to shake. And the CEO looked at my suit and decided I wasn't worth the courtesy of a handshake in front of her board. He heard Brooks go quiet on the other end. I've spent my whole life being that man in the plain suit, and I decided standing in that parking lot that I was done being quiet about it. So no, Mr. Brooks, it's not window dressing, it's the whole point. I don't want you to hang a sign. I want you to build a company where the next man in a plain suit gets his hand shaken before anybody knows what he's worth. And I want the rules written down where he can read them so he never has to wonder. There was a long silence on the line. My father, Brooks finally said, was a janitor, cleaned office buildings at night for 31 years, and I used to help him sometimes on weekends when I was a kid. And I watched the way the day people talked to my dad, or rather the way they didn't talk to him, the way they looked right through him, like he was part of the furniture. I swore I'd never look through a person like that. Built my whole company on it. His voice thickened. Mr. Carter, I don't need to think about your condition. Your condition is the reason I built this place. I'll sign it tonight. Then we have a deal, Nathan said. And Mr. Brooks, one more thing. Name it. When we announce, I don't want it to be about them. I don't ever want to say Summit's name. I don't want a single word that could look like revenge. I just want us to stand next to what we built and let people compare. Can you live with that? Mr. Carter, Brooks said, I've been standing next to what I built and letting people compare for 30 years. That's the only marketing I've ever known how to do. They hung up, and Nathan stood in his kitchen for a moment, and then Emma called from the other room. Daddy, who was that? And Nathan said, That was a man who shakes hands, sweetheart. And Emma said, Everybody shakes hands. And Nathan said, No, baby, not everybody. But the good ones do. 2 days later, the funding round collapsed completely. It happened fast, the way these things always do. At the end, the slow leak becoming a rupture in a single afternoon. The third co-investor pulled at 11 a.m. By noon, it was on every wire. By 1 o'clock, a downgrade watch had been issued on Summit's credit. By 2, the stock had shed 19% from where it had opened 3 days before, and the trading was heavy, and the analysts who'd been quiet were suddenly not quiet at all. And the phrase that kept appearing over and over in every note and every segment was the phrase that would follow Victoria Hayes for the rest of her professional life. Governance concerns. Nobody knew the specifics. The investigation was airtight, and Coleman had run it clean, and not one document had leaked. But the market didn't need the specifics. The market only needed the shape of the thing: a legendary investor walking away without explanation, a company suddenly unable to say why, a special committee, a stock in freefall, and the market filled in the shape with the worst thing it could imagine, which was, as it happened, roughly the truth. Victoria watched 22 years of work lose a fifth of its value in 6 hours, and she did the only thing left in her broken playbook. She called a mandatory all-hands meeting. She was going to give a speech. She was going to rally the troops. She was going to stand in front of the whole company and remind them who they were and where they were going. The way she'd done 100 times before, because Victoria Hayes had always been able to talk her way out of anything, had built her entire identity on the power of standing in front of a room and bending it to her will. It was without question the single worst decision she had made in a week entirely composed of them. The all-hands was at 4. 1,500 employees on the video feed, 300 in the auditorium. And Victoria Hayes walked out onto that stage with her chin up and her voice strong, and she began to speak, and for about 90 seconds it almost worked. I know the last few days have been frightening, she said. I know you've read the headlines. I know the stock has moved against us. And I want to stand here and tell you the truth, which is that this company is fundamentally sound, that our people are the best in the industry, and that we are the victims. Yes, I'll say it. The victims of a single powerful individual who decided on a whim over a personal slight to punish 2,000 hardworking families for a misunderstanding that lasted 30 seconds. And in the back of the auditorium, a hand went up. It was not a planned thing. All-hands meetings at Summit did not have Q&A. Nobody raised hands. But a hand went up anyway, and it belonged to a woman. Victoria didn't recognize a software engineer named Priya Nair, 7 years at the company, and before anyone could stop her, Priya Nair stood up and spoke, and her voice carried in a room gone suddenly dangerously quiet. With respect, Ms. Hayes, that's not the story going around the engineering floor. The story going around is that he introduced himself, and you wouldn't shake his hand because of how he was dressed. Is that not true? Because if it's not true, I think a lot of us would feel a lot better hearing you say clearly that it's not true. Victoria's smile froze on her face. 1,500 people leaned toward their screens, and Victoria Hayes, standing on a stage in front of her entire company, had one clean chance to tell the truth, and she could not do it. The word sorry was still undeletable. So instead, she reached one more time for the version where she was the victim. I'm not going to dignify a piece of gossip with, "It's not gossip if it's true," Priya said. "It's only gossip if it's false. So which is it? Sit down, please. I'd rather stand if it's all the same. There are a lot of us who've been told for years that we lack executive presence." A lot of us who watched vendors who looked like our families get turned away for not being the right cultural fit. We didn't have a word for it. And then a man in a cheap suit got his hand left hanging in the air, and suddenly we all had the same word at the same time. So I'm asking in front of everybody, did it happen the way we heard it happened? And there it was, out loud, in front of 1,500 people. The thing that had lived in the walls of Summit Dynamics for years, finally spoken by a woman brave enough to stand up in an auditorium and say it. It was not a question anymore. It was a verdict wearing the clothes of a question. Victoria opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The silence stretched for 3 seconds, then 5, then a horrible 8, and in the world of a live all-hands meeting. 8 seconds of a CEO, unable to answer whether she'd insulted a man over his clothes, is not silence. It is a confession. Somebody in the auditorium began very quietly to clap. Not for Victoria, for Priya. And then another person joined, and another. And it spread across the room, and then impossibly across the video feed. Hundreds of little clap emojis flooding the chat. A company applauding one of its own for asking out loud the question the CEO could not answer, and Victoria Hayes stood on the stage of the company she had built and watched 1,500 people turn against her in real time. And she understood finally in her body, if not yet in her pride, that it was over. She walked off the stage without finishing. It was the first time in 22 years that Victoria Hayes had ever left a room she was supposed to command. Emily Ross watched the whole thing from the wings, and she did not clap because clapping felt like a kind of cruelty, and Emily had discovered in herself a strange, unexpected grief. She'd wanted Victoria stopped. She still did. But watching a human being come apart on a stage, even a human being who had earned every second of it, was not the clean victory she'd imagined in the stairwell. It was just sad. It was the specific sadness of watching someone drown in a pool they'd spent years filling one refusal to shake a hand at a time. Her phone buzzed. A text from the Independent Counsel. We'd like to schedule your formal interview. This week. Are you still willing? Emily looked out at the emptying auditorium, at the stage where Victoria had just lost the last thing she had left, and she typed back, "Yes, I'm willing." And then because she'd been thinking about him for a week now, about the soft-spoken man who'd started all of this by simply offering his hand, she added the thing she couldn't say to anyone else. I keep thinking about the investor, Nathan Carter. He never said a word against her. He didn't have to. He just left, and the truth did the rest. I don't understand how a person becomes that patient. The reply came a minute later, and it was not from the counsel she expected, but from a name she didn't recognize, forwarded through the firm. And it was only one line, and Emily would keep it on her phone for years. People who've been underestimated their whole lives learn that the truth is the only thing that never lies for you. Everything else can be bought. Not that. A friend of the fund. Emily read it 3 times. Then she put her phone away and went to find Angela, because there was work to do, and because the thing Nathan Carter had understood, the thing he'd spent a lifetime learning, was finally beginning to spread through the building, like the first warm hour after a long, cold night. The formal interviews began the next week, and they broke the case wide open. Angela Morris sat in a conference room at the law firm's offices for 4 hours and walked independent counsel through 4 years of supplier evaluations, and she did not spare herself. That was the part that made the lawyers trust her completely. She didn't come in as a hero. She came in as a participant. I wrote some of these, she said, sliding a document across the table. This one. Not the right cultural fit. I typed that about a woman whose bid was the strongest we'd seen in 2 years. I want that on the record because I don't want anyone thinking this was one bad person at the top and a building full of victims. It wasn't. It was a bad idea at the top that made good people into small ones. I was a good person who did a small thing over and over because everyone around me was doing it, and it had a professional name so it didn't feel like what it was. The lead investigator, a sharp woman named Carol Diaz, set down her pen. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in this entire investigation, Carol said. And it's going to matter more than you know, because a case built on the villain did it all is weak. Villains have defenses. But a case built on the system trained decent people to do indecent things, And here's the documentary proof, and here's a decent person telling you exactly how it worked from the inside. That case is bulletproof. Emily's interview came 2 days later, and Emily brought the flash drive, and the flash drive changed the temperature of the entire investigation. Because Emily hadn't just kept the vendor evaluations and the board minutes. Emily had kept 2 years of email chains, in which Victoria had personally directed the softening of performance reviews for her favorites, and the sharpening of them for her targets. Emily had kept the calendar entries. Emily had kept a recording legal in a one-party consent state, made the night she got scared 2 years ago, of Victoria explaining in her own voice that a certain candidate won't fit here, and I don't need a reason. I need you to find me language that isn't a reason, but sounds like one. Language that isn't a reason, but sounds like one. Carol Diaz played that recording 3 times in a silent conference room, and then she looked at Emily Ross, and she said very quietly, "Do you understand what you have here?" "I think so," Emily said. "You have the whole thing, in her own voice, the entire mechanism." She didn't just have a bias you can argue about. She systematized it. She built a machine for turning prejudice into paperwork, and she described the machine out loud. Carol shook her head slowly. "In 11 years of doing this work, I have never had a subject explain their own misconduct better than the evidence could have." She confessed 2 years before she was ever accused, and that was the second great turn of the whole affair. The one nobody had seen coming. Not Nathan, not Coleman, not Emily herself, when she'd made the recording out of nothing but fear. Victoria Hayes had not been undone by the handshake. The handshake had only opened the door. Victoria Hayes had been undone in the end by her own voice recorded 2 years earlier by a frightened assistant she'd never once bothered to see as a threat, because Victoria had never in her life imagined that the quiet people around her, the assistants, the procurement directors, the man in the plain suit, were people at all in the way that mattered. She'd spent her whole career being unable to see exactly the kind of person who would eventually bring her down. That blindness wasn't incidental to her fall. It was her fall. It was the same blindness that had left a hand hanging in the air, and it ran all the way to the bottom of her. Meanwhile, the machinery of the world had begun to move in Nathan's direction quietly, without a press release exactly as he'd wanted. The Carter Fund's investment in Pioneer Systems was announced on a Tuesday in a 2-paragraph statement, so understated, it almost disappeared, and the only remarkable thing in it was the single sentence at the end, noting that the investment was contingent on Pioneer's newly adopted publicly available framework for transparent bias-resistant hiring and procurement. The financial press, which had spent a week failing to get anyone at the Carter Fund to explain the summit withdrawal, seized on the contrast instantly. Nobody had to draw the line. The line drew itself. Here was the most respected quiet money in the country, walking away from one company under a governance cloud and walking toward a competitor whose defining new feature was that it had promised in writing to shake every hand. Pioneer's stock jumped 11% on the announcement. 2 of Summit's largest clients quietly opened conversations with Pioneer's sales team within 72 hours. And Daniel Brooks, being exactly the man Nathan had bet he was, gave precisely one interview about the framework in which he mentioned Summit not even once and said only, "We wrote our rules down, so anybody who walks through our door knows exactly how they'll be judged." Seemed like the decent thing. I'm surprised it's news. Nathan watched it all unfold from his kitchen table, mostly while helping Emma with homework, and he said almost nothing to anyone. And when Marcus called to tell him Pioneer had just landed its second Summit client, Nathan only said, "Good, now watch. This is the part where it stops being about Summit at all." "What do you mean?" "I mean people are going to start asking their own companies the same question," Nathan said. Priya Nair stood up in an auditorium and asked it out loud, and it's not going to stay in that auditorium. It never does. That's the thing nobody with power ever understands until it's too late. You can leave one man's hand hanging in the air and maybe you get away with it. But somebody's always watching. And the watching ones, the quiet ones, the ones you never bothered to see, they remember. And one day, they all decide to remember out loud at the same time. He glanced at Emma, showing her work tongue between her teeth. "That's not revenge, Marcus. I never wanted revenge. That's just the truth finally getting to speak in its own voice." Back at Summit, the special committee reconvened on a Thursday, And this time, there was no version of events left for Victoria to offer. The evidence had piled up past the point of argument. Doug Feeney's retaliation memo, Angela's 4 years of evaluations, Emily's recordings, the all-hands video in which the CEO of a public company had stood on a stage and been unable to answer whether she'd insulted a man over his clothes. And underneath all of it, the quiet, patient fact that a legendary investor had walked away and never once had to explain why. Because the company had spent the following weeks explaining it for him in his stead, in 1,000 different ways, none of them good. Richard Coleman opened the session, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not need to. "We're not here to relitigate a handshake," he said. "We got past the handshake a long time ago. The handshake was a symptom. We're here because of what the symptom pointed to, and because of everything this company's leadership did afterward to make a bad thing catastrophic. The lie to this board, the attempt to alter the minutes, the retaliation against the 2 employees who came forward, the systematic apparatus for disguising bias as business judgment described in the CEO's own recorded voice." He set down his glasses. "I'll tell you what I told 2 brave women in my office a couple of weeks ago. This wasn't built by one person. It was permitted by all of us. And now every one of us has to decide whether we're going to keep permitting it, or whether we're finally going to do the hard thing we were appointed to do." He looked around the table at 11 faces at the 6 who'd been in the room the day the hand went unshaken. "There's a vote coming," he said. "Not today, but it's coming, and I want everyone to spend the time between now and then being honest with themselves about one question. It's the only question that's ever mattered in this whole affair, and I'm going to leave you with it." He stood. "If Nathan Carter had walked in wearing a $10,000 suit," Richard Coleman said, "and stepped out of a car with a driver and handed Victoria a card with $4 billion printed on it, would any of this have happened? Would the hand have gone unshaken? Would the culture that produced 4 years of those evaluations even exist?" He picked up his folder. "You already know the answer. Every one of you knows it. And the day you can sit with that answer honestly is the day this company might actually be worth saving." He walked out, and behind him, at the far end of the table, Victoria Hayes sat alone, surrounded by empty chairs that had, one by one over the last hour, been pushed slightly away from her by people who no longer wanted to be seen sitting close, and she stared at the polished surface of the table she had commanded for 11 years, and she saw reflected in it the thin, uncertain face of a woman who had spent a lifetime being judged by her appearance, and had sworn once long ago that she would climb high enough that no one could ever do it to her again. She had climbed all the way to the top, and she had become the thing she'd sworn to escape, and she had done it so slowly and so completely that she'd never once felt the change until the morning. A quiet man in a plain suit had held out his hand, and she had looked at it, and she had seen nothing there worth taking. She had seen nothing. That in the end was the whole of it. Not cruelty, not even really malice. Just a woman who had lost somewhere along the terrible climb the ability to see a person standing right in front of her. And the most frightening part, the part that kept her awake that night and every night after, was that until 3 weeks ago, she hadn't even known it was gone. The night before the vote, Victoria Hayes did the thing she'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. She hired the best lawyer she could find, and she sat across from him at 11 o'clock at night, and she laid out her version of events, and she waited for him to tell her how to win. He listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. He was a silver-haired litigator named Franklin Reese, who had defended CEOs through scandals that made the evening news. And when Victoria finished, he took off his glasses, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said the thing no one had been willing to say to her face in 22 years. "Ms. Hayes, I'm going to give you the most expensive advice you'll ever get, and I'm going to give it to you for free, because it's the only advice worth anything here." He folded his hands. "You cannot win this. That's not what I'm paying you for. You're paying me for the truth whether you know it or not, and here it is. I've read the evidence package your general counsel was required to share. The recording alone ends you. Your own voice describing how to disguise a bias as a business reason. There is no jury on earth, no arbitrator, no board that hears you say the words, language that isn't a reason, but sounds like one, and comes back on your side. You didn't just do a bad thing. You explained the machine, in your own voice, 2 years ago." He leaned forward. So I'm not going to help you win because winning isn't on the menu. I'm going to help you lose smaller. That's the whole game now. And losing smaller starts with something you are not going to want to hear. Say it. Stop fighting. Every move you've made to protect yourself has become evidence against you. The lie to the board. The minutes. The retaliation file you tried to build. Every single one made it worse. You are a person who, when cornered, digs. And you have got to stop digging tonight, or there won't be anything left to save. Not the company, not your severance, not your license to ever sit on another board in this country. He held her eyes. Resign before they vote. Take the small loss instead of the total one. It's the only smart move left. And Victoria Hayes, who had never once in her life taken a loss she could avoid, looked at the finest lawyer money could buy and heard him tell her to surrender, and something in her, some last cornered animal thing, refused. No, she said. I built this company. They will have to throw me out. I am not going to walk out on my knees for a handshake. Franklin Reese put his glasses back on and closed his folder and stood up, and at the door he said one last thing gently, the way you'd say it to someone you'd given up on. It was never about the handshake, Ms. Hayes. That's what you still don't understand, and it's why you're going to lose everything instead of just most of it. The handshake was the 1 second the whole world got to see what your company already knew. You keep defending the second. Nobody's prosecuting the second. They're prosecuting the years. He opened the door. Get some sleep. You're going to need it tomorrow. And for a long time after. He left, and Victoria sat alone in the dark with the truth. She still could not make herself believe, and somewhere down in the deepest part of her, a small voice that sounded like a much younger woman. A woman who'd been turned away from rooms for wearing the wrong shoes. A woman who'd been told she lacked presence. A woman who'd sworn she'd never let anyone make her feel like nothing again. That small voice said very quietly, "You became them." And Victoria did what she'd always done with that voice. She drowned it out with anger, and she went to bed and she did not sleep. The vote was scheduled for 2 o'clock the next afternoon, and at 1:30, something happened that no one had planned for. Nathan Carter called Richard Coleman. Coleman's assistant nearly dropped the phone. In 3 weeks, the Carter Fund had not returned a single one of Summit's calls, had not sent a single message, had done nothing at all except quietly fund a competitor and let the silence do its work. And now, 30 minutes before the vote that would decide Victoria's fate, the man himself was on the line, asking for the board chair. Coleman took it in his office with the door closed. "Mr. Carter, I'll be honest, I didn't expect to hear from you." "I didn't expect a call," Nathan said. "I want to be clear about why I am because it matters. I'm not calling to influence your vote. What you decide about your CEO is your business, and I have no standing in it, and I don't want any. Whatever you do, the fund's position doesn't change. We're out of Summit, and we're not coming back, and that's got nothing to do with what happens in your boardroom this afternoon." "Then why the call?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. Coleman could hear faintly a child's voice somewhere in the background of the call, and it struck him as strange and human. The idea that the man who'd brought his company to its knees was sitting in a kitchen somewhere with a kid. "Because I heard 2 of your employees came forward," Nathan said. "A procurement director and an assistant. And I heard the CEO tried to build files on them and tried to have your HR head paper their records. I heard she tried to make them pay for telling the truth." His voice hardened just slightly for the first time in the whole conversation. "I don't care what you do about Victoria Hayes, Mr. Coleman, but I care a great deal about what happens to those 2 women. Because I know exactly what it costs to be the person in the plain suit who stood up. I've been that person. And I'm calling to tell you that the entire investment community is going to be watching what happens to your whistleblowers a lot more closely than they watch what happens to your CEO. If those 2 women are still standing a year from now, thriving, promoted, safe, then maybe Summit's worth something after all. And if they're quietly pushed out the way whistleblowers usually are, then it won't matter who you make CEO. Nobody serious will ever trust that building again, including me." Coleman was silent for a long moment. "Understood," he said finally. "And Mr. Carter, for whatever it's worth, coming from a man whose board let this happen for 6 years, I'm sorry for what my company did to you in that room." "I appreciate that," Nathan said. "But I'm not the one who's owed it. Save it for them." and he hung up. Richard Coleman sat with the phone in his hand for a full minute. Then he stood, and he walked into the boardroom, and he found that the call had changed something in him, clarified it, hardened it into shape. He'd been thinking of vote as an ending, a punishment, a closing of accounts. Now he understood it was a beginning, and that the thing being decided wasn't really Victoria's fate at all. Victoria's fate had been decided 3 weeks ago in a parking lot. What was being decided today was whether the company had learned anything, or whether it was just going to swap one face at the top and keep the machine running underneath. At 2 o'clock the board convened for the final time on the matter, and Victoria Hayes walked in and took her seat at the head of the table, because she was still technically the CEO, and she would be until the vote stripped it from her, and she was determined to make them do it in the light. Coleman let her speak first. It was the last courtesy the board would extend her, and everyone in the room understood it as such. Victoria stood. She had prepared remarks. She had prepared them all night, and they were in their way, magnificent. A defense of her record, the growth numbers, the 2,200 jobs she'd created, the 2 recessions she'd steered them through, the shareholders she'd made rich. And for about 4 minutes, it was the old Victoria, commanding and sharp and utterly persuasive. And Laura Bennett, watching from 3 seats down, felt an old traitorous flicker of the admiration she'd once had for this woman before it all curdled. And then Victoria made her mistake. Her last one, as it turned out. Because she could not help herself. She reached the end of the numbers, and instead of stopping, instead of sitting down while she was ahead, she turned to the one subject she could never leave alone. And I would remind this board, she said, her voice rising, that everything we've suffered these past weeks traces back to one moment. One man's wounded pride. One investor who decided that a 30-second social misunderstanding was worth destroying 2,000 livelihoods over. If you want to talk about character, let's talk about the character of a man who would freeze $180 million because he wasn't fawned over the instant he walked in the door. That's not the behavior of a great man. That's the behavior of a fragile one. And the room, which had been listening, went cold. It was David Okafor again, the junior board member, the one who'd broken her story open 3 weeks ago. He didn't stand this time. He just spoke quietly, and the quiet was worse. He didn't freeze the deal because he wasn't fawned over, David said. He froze it because you looked at a man and decided he was nothing before you knew a single thing about him. And the reason that's disqualifying to a man like Carter isn't that his feelings got hurt. It's that he understood something in that second that took the rest of us 3 weeks and a federal-grade investigation to figure out. He understood that a person who'll treat a nobody like garbage is a person who has garbage in them, and it'll come out everywhere, in every evaluation, every hire, every vendor, every decision forever. He didn't overreact, Ms. Hayes. He read you correctly in 4 seconds. And everything that's happened since has just been the rest of us catching up to what he already knew. David paused. You want to call that fragile? I'd call it the best due diligence I've ever seen in my life. Silence. And Victoria Hayes, standing at the head of her table for the last time, looked around the room and finally saw it. The thing that had been true for 3 weeks, and that she'd refused with everything in her to see. There was no ally left. Not one. Not Laura, who wouldn't meet her eyes. Not Coleman, who watched her with the flat calm of a man doing a hard duty. Not the 6 who'd been in the room, not the 5 who hadn't, not a single human being at that long table who was on her side. She was alone. She had been alone, she realized, for a very long time. She'd just always had enough power that being alone had felt like being above. Sit down, Victoria, Coleman said, not unkindly. It's time to vote. She sat. The vote took 90 seconds. It was not close. It was not close at all. One by one around the table, they voted to remove Victoria Hayes as Chief Executive Officer of Summit Dynamics for cause for failures in leadership, for the systematic concealment of organizational risk, for lying to the board, for attempting to alter official records, and for the attempted retaliation against employees who had come forward in good faith. When it reached Laura Bennett. Laura closed her eyes for a second before she spoke, and then she opened them and looked directly at the woman she'd stood beside for 11 years, and she said, I, for cause. And it was the hardest word Laura had ever said, and it was also, she knew, the truest. The vote passed. Unanimous save for Victoria's own, which was not solicited. Richard Coleman entered it into the record, and then he looked down the table. Victoria, the board has voted to terminate your employment as CEO effective immediately. Peter Sung will walk you through the separation terms and the ongoing obligations under the litigation hold. Security will accompany you to your office to collect personal effects. I'm sorry it came to this. I want you to know that I mean that even though I know it doesn't help. Victoria stood one final time. And here at the very end, the room braced for one last fight, one last speech, one last denial. It didn't come. Instead, Victoria. Hayes looked around the table one more time at the empty distance her own choices had put between herself and every other person in the room, and something in her face broke open just for a second, just long enough for everyone to see the frightened younger woman underneath the armor she'd worn for 22 years. And she opened her mouth, and what came out was not a defense and not an attack. It was almost a whisper. When did I become like this? Nobody answered. Nobody could. It was not a question anyone but Victoria could answer, and she wasn't ready to, not yet. She gathered her things, and she walked out of the boardroom of the company she had built from 22 people, and the door closed behind her, and it was over. In the hallway outside, Emily Ross was standing by the elevators, not by design, just by the accident of where the day had put her. And Victoria, walking out with a security guard, a respectful 3 steps behind her, stopped when she saw her. For a moment, the two women just looked at each other. The CEO who'd tried to have her fired, and the assistant who'd refused to lie. And Emily braced for cruelty, because cruelty was the only language Victoria had ever spoken to her. But Victoria didn't have any cruelty left. She'd spent it all. What she had in that moment was something closer to bewilderment. "You kept everything," Victoria said. It wasn't an accusation. It was almost wonder. 2 years. You were scared of me for 2 years, and you still kept everything. I wasn't keeping it to hurt you, Emily said quietly. I was keeping it because I was afraid of exactly this. I didn't want to be the person who helped. That's all it ever was. I just didn't want to be the person who helped. Victoria absorbed that. And then she said the closest thing to an apology she was capable of that day, which was not much, but was more than she'd managed to anyone in weeks. You were better at this than I ever gave you credit for. I know, Emily said. Not cruel, just true. That was kind of the whole problem, Ms. Hayes. And Victoria Hayes almost smiled a terrible tired ghost of a smile, and she got in the elevator and the doors closed, and Emily Ross stood alone in the hallway and discovered that she was crying, and could not have said if you'd asked her whether it was from relief or from grief, or from the plain human sorrow of watching someone lose everything, even someone who'd earned it. The news broke within the hour. Summit Dynamics removes CEO for cause. Board cites governance and conduct failures. The stock, which had been in freefall for 3 weeks, did something strange and telling. It ticked up. 4%, then 6%. Because the market, which had punished Summit for the mystery, rewarded it for the resolution. Removing Victoria didn't fix the hole in the balance sheet, but it told every nervous investor and every wavering client the one thing they needed to hear, that the company had finally decided to be a different kind of company. That the machine was being dismantled and not just repainted. By the end of the day, the board had named an interim CEO, and it was the obvious choice, the only choice, the person who had spent 3 weeks trying to save the company from the inside while its leader tried to burn it down to save herself. Laura Bennett. Laura took the call from Coleman in her office at 6 p.m., and when he told her the board wanted her to step in, she was quiet for so long that Coleman thought the line had dropped. Laura, I'm here, she said. I'm just Richard. I sat in that room 3 weeks ago. I watched it happen. I could have said something faster. I could have chased him down before he made the call. I could have... Stop, Coleman said gently. Every one of us has a version of that sentence, Laura. Every single one. The difference between you and the rest of us is that when it mattered, you're the one who stood up in that office and told Victoria to her face what she'd done. You called it out loud when it cost you something. That's why it's you. Not because you're clean, because you're honest. And honest is the only thing this company hasn't had at the top in a very long time. Laura closed her eyes. I'll do it, she said. But I want it understood, I'm not taking this job to steady the ship and hand it to someone shinier in 6 months. If I take it to change the thing that made all of this possible. All the way down. The evaluations, the hiring, the culture, the language, all of it. I'll fix the balance sheet, sure. But if I don't fix the reason we're here, then I'm just a nicer face on the same machine, and I won't do that. Not after what I've seen. That, Coleman said, is exactly why the board wants you. Go be the CEO, Laura. Go build the company we all should have been building for 6 years. She hung up, and she sat alone in her office, the new interim chief executive of a company in crisis. And the first thing she did before the press strategy, before the client calls, before the balance sheet, was pick up the phone and dial an internal extension. Angela, it's Laura Bennett. I know it's late. Listen, I'm going to be running things for a while starting tonight. And the very first thing I want to do before anything else is put you in charge of rebuilding procurement from the ground up. All of it. Transparent scoring, published criteria, the whole framework. You saw it before any of us. You documented it when it was dangerous too. I can't think of a single person more qualified to fix it than the person who was brave enough to prove it was broken. A pause. Will you do it? On the other end, Angela Morris, who had spent 4 years quietly making herself smaller, writing phrases she was ashamed of, absorbing a bias she hadn't chosen, began very softly to cry. Yes, she said. God, yes, I'll do it. Good, Laura said. Because we've got a lot of hands to shake, Angela. And we've been leaving too many of them hanging for too long. Across the city, Nathan Carter got the news. The way he got most news, quietly on his phone, standing at the kitchen counter, while his daughter did her reading at the table. Marcus texted him the headline. She's out. Board voted for cause. Bennett's interim CEO. Nathan read it, and he set the phone down, and he did not feel the thing he might once have expected to feel. There was no triumph in it. There was only a kind of quiet, tired relief. The relief of a man who'd set something true in motion and watched it arrive, where truth always eventually arrives, if you're patient enough and you don't get in its way. Daddy, Emma said, not looking up from her book. You're doing the face. What face? The sad, happy face. The one you do when you're thinking about Mommy. Nathan came and sat down across from her. I wasn't thinking about Mommy, he said. But you're right that it's the same face. I was thinking about a promise I made a long time ago, before you were born. What promise? That if I ever got to be, he searched for the word, an 8-year-old would understand. If I ever got to be important, I'd use it to be kind. Especially to people other important people forgot to be kind to. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Somebody was unkind to me a few weeks ago, Em. Really unkind. And instead of being unkind back, I just told the truth and waited. And today the truth kind of finished the job. Emma considered this with the enormous seriousness she brought to everything. Did you win? She asked. And Nathan Carter thought about that for a long moment, because it was, he realized, the exact right question. The only question, the one Coleman had put to his board, and the one Franklin Reese had put to Victoria, and the one this whole long month had really been about all along. No, baby, he said finally. I don't think it was the kind of thing you win. I think it was the kind of thing you just try not to lose. Try not to lose the part of you that puts your hand out, even when somebody leaves it hanging in the air. He smiled at her. That's the only thing I was ever really trying to keep. And I kept it. So yeah, maybe that's winning. Keeping the thing that matters when it would have been easier to let it go. Emma nodded slowly, like she understood. And maybe she did, in the way children understand the important things before they have the words for them. Your tie's on the floor again, she said. Nathan laughed, the first full laugh he'd laughed in weeks, and he reached down and picked it up. I'll hang it up, he said. I promise. I'm going to start keeping all my promises, Em. Even the small ones. Especially the small ones. And a mile away, in an empty apartment, she suddenly couldn't afford. The meaning of Victoria Hayes sat alone with a glass of wine. She wasn't drinking, and she pulled out a legal pad, and at the top of the first page, she wrote 4 words, and then she stared at them for a very long time, unable to write the 5th. When did I become? She couldn't finish it. Not yet. But for the first time in 22 years, she'd written the question down instead of drowning it out. And somewhere in the deepest, most frightened, most human part of her, the part that had once been a young woman turned away from rooms for wearing the wrong shoes, something that had been frozen for a very long time began almost imperceptibly to thaw. The months that followed did not move the way Victoria Hayes had feared they would. She had braced for a swift, clean fall, the kind that ends in a headline and then silence. What she got instead was slower and stranger, and in the end more merciful, though it would take her the better part of a year to understand it as mercy. Summit Dynamics did not die. That was the first surprise, and it surprised everyone, including the analysts who'd written its obituary. Under Laura Bennett, the company did the one thing that its markets had stopped believing it capable of, which was to tell the truth about itself in public and then actually change. Laura's first act as permanent CEO. The board dropped the word interim within 90 days once they saw what she was building was to release voluntarily a summary of the governance investigation. Not the whole thing, the lawyers wouldn't allow that. But enough. Enough for every employee and every client and every investor to understand exactly what had gone wrong and exactly what was being done about it. She stood in front of the same auditorium where Victoria had walked off the stage, in front of the same 1,500 employees, and she did the thing Victoria had never once been able to do in her life. She said she was sorry. "I was in the room," Laura told them, "the day it happened. I watched a man offer his hand and get treated like he was nothing, and I didn't stop it fast enough, and I've had to live with that. So I'm not going to stand up here and pretend I'm the hero who rode in to fix everything. I'm one of the people who let it get bad enough to need fixing. And the only thing I know how to do with that is to make absolutely certain it never happens in this building again." She looked out at them. "So here's what we're going to do, and I'm going to show you all of it in the light where you can hold me to it." And then she showed them. The supplier evaluations went fully transparent within 4 months. Every vendor who bid on Summit business would from now on receive a written scorecard showing exactly how they'd been rated on exactly which measurable criteria, with the soft narrative box, the one that had hidden 4 years of bias behind phrases like cultural fit, removed entirely. Angela Morris built the whole framework herself, and she built it the way only someone who'd once been part of the problem could build it, with a specificity that left no room for a bias to hide. She knew every place a prejudice could tuck itself into a process, because she'd tucked them there herself, and now she went through and closed every door one at a time. 6 months in a mid-sized logistics firm, won a major Summit contract on the strength of a transparent published score. It was a company run by a black woman named Denise Rollins, the same. Denise Rollins, whose bid Angela had once rejected with the words, "Not the right cultural fit, 2 years and a lifetime ago." Angela made the call herself to deliver the news, and she did something no procurement director had ever done in that company's history. She apologized. She told Denise the truth about the old evaluation, all of it, and she told her that the reason the process was different now was that people like Denise had been failed by the old one. There was a long silence on the phone, and then Denise Rollins said, "You know how many times somebody in your position has said cultural fit to me over 20 years? I stopped counting at 40. And you know how many of them ever called me back to say it was wrong?" A pause. "You're the first. So, I'll take the contract, and I'll take the apology. But mostly, I'll take the fact that you called." Angela hung up and sat in her office and thought about how a single unshaken hand 3 floors up and a year in the past had reached all the way down through the whole company and out into the world, and finally shaken the hand of a woman who deserved it all along. Emily Ross did not stay an assistant. Laura promoted her within the first month, and then again, and by the end of the year, Emily Ross held a title that hadn't existed at Summit before Laura invented it for her Director of Corporate Integrity. Her job, in plain terms, was to be the person Victoria had punished her for being, the one who keeps the records honest, the one who won't rewrite the minutes, the one who says no when no is the true answer. Laura gave her a mandate and a budget, and most importantly, a direct line to the board that no executive could cut off. Never again, Laura said, would a person in that building have to keep secret backups out of fear. Now the honesty would be the job, not the risk. Emily took to it the way a person takes to the thing they were quietly built for all along. And she kept framed on her desk, where she could see it every day, a printout of the one-line message she'd received the night of the all-hands, forwarded from a stranger through the law firm. People who've been underestimated their whole lives learn that the truth is the only thing that never lies for you. Everything else can be bought. Not that. She never did find out for certain who'd sent it. But she had a guess. And the guess made her smile every time she looked at it. As for Nathan Carter, he did the thing that Marcus had known for 19 years that he would eventually do. He built something. He called it the First-Hand Initiative, and he announced it on a Tuesday, in the same understated way he announced everything. 2 paragraphs and no fanfare, and it was the most personal thing he had ever done with his money. It was an investment program, but it was not really about the money, or rather, the money was just the vehicle for the thing it was actually about. The First-Hand Initiative existed to find the people. The rest of the market looked through the overlooked entrepreneurs, the small family firms, the single parents building something out of a garage, the men and women who walked into rooms in their one good suit and got mistaken for couriers. And it existed to give them not just capital, but the one thing Nathan had spent his whole life wishing someone had handed him early, a set of rules written down transparent that told them exactly how they'd be judged, so they never had to wonder whether the door was closed before they even reached it. The whole point, Nathan told the small team he assembled to run it, is that nobody who comes to us ever has to guess. They see the criteria on day one. They know the how. My daughter taught me that you don't get the points. Even if you're right, you have to show your work. Well, we're going to show our work. Every applicant, every decision, every reason. Because the thing that ruined Summit wasn't cruelty. It was hiding. Bias survives in the dark, in the vague word, in the reason that isn't a reason, but sounds like one. So we're going to turn the lights on and leave them on. That's the entire strategy. Light. The First-Hand Initiative funded its first 11 companies within 6 months. 9 of them were led by people who had been rejected at least once, somewhere else, for reasons that had never been written down. One of them was a former Summit vendor. One of them was run by a single mother of 3, who had been told by a bank that she didn't present as a founder, whatever that had ever meant. Nathan met with every single one of them personally, and the first thing he did every single time without exception, before he knew a thing about their numbers, or their business, or their potential, was stand up, walk over, and offer his hand. It was the whole philosophy in one gesture, and everyone who received it understood somewhere in their chest that they had just been seen in a way they were not used to being seen. Nearly a year to the day after the handshake that never happened, a letter arrived at the offices of the Carter Fund. It was handwritten on plain stationery, and it had no return address, and Marcus almost threw it out with the rest of the unsolicited mail before he saw the name at the bottom and brought it to Nathan instead. It was from Victoria Hayes. Nathan read it alone in his kitchen in the evening after Emma had gone to bed. It was not long. Victoria had never been a woman of many words when the words mattered most, and it had clearly cost her something enormous to write even these. She did not ask for anything. That was the first thing Nathan noticed, and it told him that whatever had happened to Victoria Hayes in the year since her fall, it had been real. She did not ask for a meeting or a second chance or a job or forgiveness. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. She had at long last run entirely out of the version where she was the victim. What she wrote instead was simple. She wrote that she had spent the year for the first time in her adult life without a title, without a company, without the armor she had worn for 22 years, and that in the quiet of that stripped-down life, she had finally been able to hear the question she'd started writing on a legal pad the night she was fired and never been able to finish. When did I become like this? She wrote that she'd traced it all the way back past the company, past the climb, back to a young woman who'd been judged for her shoes and her accent and her lack of presence. A young woman who'd made a private vow to become so powerful that no one could ever do it to her again. And she wrote the thing that had taken her a whole year and the loss of everything to finally see that she had kept the vow, and in keeping it, she had become the exact thing that had hurt her. She had climbed the whole mountain to escape the people who looked through others, and at the summit, she had turned into one of them. And she had done it so gradually that she'd never felt the moment it happened. She wrote that she'd spent years reading a person's status before she ever bothered to read their character. And that a man in a plain suit had held out his hand, and she'd read his status, found it wanting, and never once thought to read anything else. And that this not the lost deal, not the fired job, not the ruined name. This was the thing she was actually sorry for. Not sorry to him, even though she was. Sorry about herself. Sorry for the person she'd let herself become while she wasn't watching. She closed the letter with a single sentence, and it was, "Nathan thought the truest thing she'd probably written in 20 years. I don't expect this to matter to you, and I'm not writing it so that it will. I'm writing it because I finally understand that you weren't testing me that day. You were just being a decent man. And I couldn't tell the difference, and that's the whole tragedy of my life in one sentence." Nathan set the letter down on the kitchen table and sat with it for a long time. He thought about Sarah and what she'd have said. The whole point of climbing up there is so you can reach a hand back down. He thought about Emma asleep down the hall and the world she'd grow up into and the kind of man he wanted her to believe was possible. He thought about the young woman Victoria had once been turned away from rooms, and how terrifyingly easily a wound could turn a person into the thing that had wounded them if they let the wound do the driving. He'd had that wound too. He'd carried it his whole life. And the only difference between his path and Victoria's, he understood, was not that he'd been stronger or better or wiser. It was that somewhere along the way, someone had loved him enough to say, "Don't you ever let them make you hard." And he'd listened. That was all. That was the whole difference. Someone had said it, and he'd listened, and Victoria had never had the someone or had never listened, and so she'd become hard, and the hardness had cost her everything. It could have gone the other way. For both of them. That was the thing that kept him at the table so long. It could have gone the other way. He picked up a pen, and he thought for a while about what to write, and he discarded a dozen responses because most of them said too much. And Nathan had learned across a whole lifetime that the truest things are almost always the shortest. In the end, he wrote a single sentence, and he sent it, and it was the only reply he ever made to Victoria Hayes, and she kept it for the rest of her life. The first handshake should never depend on the second impression. She read it 100 times, and she understood it finally all the way down. The point had never been that she'd misjudged how important he was. The point was that she'd made a person's worth conditional at all, that she'd built her whole life around a second impression, around status and title and appearance, and what a person could do for her, and had lost the ability to offer the first thing, the free thing, the human thing, the hand extended before you know anything at all. The first handshake. The one that doesn't wait to find out if you're worth it. The one that just says, simply, "I see you and you are a person, and that is enough." She had spent 22 years unable to offer it. And it had taken losing everything to understand that it had been the only thing worth offering all along. Victoria Hayes did not become a saint. Stories that end with the villain transformed into a hero are lies, and this is not that story. She did not get her company back or her name or the 22 years. She rebuilt slowly, quietly in a smaller life, and she was by every account of the people who knew her afterward, a different woman than she'd been, not soft exactly, but no longer armored, still ambitious, but no longer starving. A person who had learned at terrible cost the single lesson that all her success had never taught her. She took a modest advisory role at a nonprofit 2 years later, helping formerly incarcerated people re-enter the workforce, and the people there said she had a particular gift for one thing above all others. She was extraordinary, they said, at looking at a person the rest of the world had written off and seeing something there worth taking a chance on. She had learned at last how to read character before status. She'd just had to lose everything built on status first, and summit dynamics, 1.5 years. After a hand was left hanging in the air was a genuinely different company. Not perfect. No company is perfect, but honest. In a way, it had never been transparent in a way that had cost it in the short term and rewarded it enormously in the long one. The best people in the industry wanted to work there precisely because of how it had handled its worst moment. Clients trusted it more, not less, because it had shown the whole world exactly what it did when the machine broke. Laura Bennett ran it for 11 more years and retired a legend, and she always said in every interview that the best thing that ever happened to Summit was the day it hit rock bottom, because rock bottom was the only place solid enough to build something true on top of. But the ending of this story is not in a boardroom or a headline or a letter. The ending of this story is exactly where the whole thing began, with a nervous man in an inexpensive suit walking through a door, unsure whether he belongs. It was a community business center on the east side of the city. One of a dozen the First Hand Initiative had funded to mentor first-time entrepreneurs, and Nathan Carter still came in person every week because the money was never the point, and it had never been the point. He was sitting at a table reviewing a business plan with a young woman when the door opened and a man came in. He was maybe 40. He wore a suit that had cost him money. He didn't really have pressed Kelly, a little out of date. He carried a folder held together with a rubber band, and he stood just inside the door with the specific posture Nathan knew in his bones, the posture of a man who has been made to feel in 100 rooms across 100 hard years that he does not belong, that he is a courier, that he is furniture, that he is nothing. He looked around the room, and he looked at the confident people already seated, and Nathan watched him begin very slightly to shrink, to make himself smaller. The way Nathan had spent his own life, making himself smaller. The way Angela had. The way anyone learns to when the world keeps telling them there isn't room. The man had a daughter. Nathan could tell somehow, maybe the careful way he held the folder, maybe just the tiredness in his face that Nathan recognized from his own mirror. A single father, probably. A man who'd put on his one good suit and walked into a building where he was already certain before anyone had said a word that he'd already been judged and found wanting. And before anyone else in the room could speak, before the man could shrink another inch, before the old cruel machinery of first impressions could turn even once, Nathan Carter stood up. He crossed the room. And he did the thing he had done 10,000 times in 10,000 rooms, the thing a woman had once left hanging in the air in front of 11 people. The thing that had started an avalanche that brought down a company and rebuilt it. Truer, the thing his wife had begged him never to lose, and he never had the simple human-free thing that costs nothing and means everything. He put out his hand. "Nathan Carter," he said, and he smiled warm and certain and glad. "Welcome to the table." And the man looked at the outstretched hand for just a second, disbelieving the way you look at a kindness you've stopped expecting. And then he took it, and he shook it, and something in his shoulders came loose that had been clenched for a very long time. This time the hand was not left hanging. This time nobody had to prove they were worth the courtesy before they received it. This time respect came first, and that is the whole of it. The entire lesson buried in a single refused handshake, and everything that grew from it. That the measure of a person is not how they treat the powerful, but how they treat the one they believe can do nothing for them. That character is what you offer before you know what you'll get back. That the first handshake must never ever wait for the second impression. Victoria Hayes lost everything learning it. Nathan Carter had known it all along, and it had cost him nothing and given him everything, because a man who leads with his hand out will never once at the end of his life have to wonder whether he was a good one. He was. The hand goes out first. It always should. That is the beginning and the end of it, and it is the only thing